everyone. My name is Sarah Lynne Bowman, and I'm from the Transformative Play Initiative at Uppsala University's Department of Game Design. And today we're going to talk about transformative role-playing game design, and I'm going to give you a theoretical framework. So first of all, what is a role-playing game? A role-playing game is the enactment of a character in a co-created fictional world. So there's this creation of a magic circle of play in which the social and physical rules of reality differ from daily life. And while props and costumes may exist, the fiction exists mostly in the minds of the participants. And we call this subjective diegesis. The audience members are also its participants and its co-creators. So role-playing has what we call a first-person audience, meaning that the people participating are the people who are also in the audience. And while fantasy, science fiction, and post-apocalyptic fiction are common, role-playing games can be of any genre, setting, or theme. So there are three main types of role-playing games, and there's some variety within these, of course. The first is virtual or digital role-playing games. These are text-based or graphical games that use a computer interface, and they can be either single player or multiplayer. There's also tabletop role-playing, which is usually played sitting at a table, sometimes with dice, character sheets, and miniatures. And this is less physical and more verbal. And there's also live action role-playing, or LARP, which is physically embodied role-playing, sometimes with costumes, props, and special locations. So at their core, I've argued that there are three primary functions of role-playing games. There's community creation, which is a form of ritual enactment. We'll get into that a lot more later. There's skill training. So for example, scenario building, problem solving, and practicing pro-social behaviors. And then there's identity exploration, for example, alternative gender expression. And again, we'll be discussing that more in depth later. So one of the questions that we often get asked is, what is transformation? And so we're going to give you our definitions of transformation that might be different than others that you hear, but it's important for us to make clear our terms in order to establish what it is we're trying to study. So our definitions of transformation are: 1, a prolonged and sustained state of change, and 2, a process or series of processes that lead to growth. So when these are inspired by role-playing experiences, transformational experiences can be a state that alter a person's view of themselves or others in significant ways, a state that shifts the way a person relates to others interpersonally, or a state that has the potential to shift social and cultural dynamics in ways that can build towards greater awareness, peace, and justice. Thus, our view of transformation with these definitions is inherently progressive, meaning that we are interested in using role-playing games as a medium to help people progress from one state to another, one that is more beneficial to both the individual and the group. We want to help people commit to processes of change that are necessary for personal and social growth. We want to help work to reduce suffering in people and in others, as well as themselves, and improve overall well-being. We want to help people align with a sense of purpose, meaning, and authenticity whenever possible. And we want to connect with other people in ways that build confidence and trust in the hopes of renewing faith in the human capacity for care and support. So these are rather lofty goals to put on the back of a role-playing game, but we find that a lot of people have these kinds of responses to play, and we're going to go into more of that now. So let's start with that first definition. Transformation is a prolonged and sustained state of change. We're going to make a distinction here between transformation and transition. And this is going to get a little confusing because the word transition in certain contexts often means transformation, and I'll make clear when that is. But for our purposes, transition is a temporary state from one state of consciousness to another. And by temporary, we mean literally bounded by time and sometimes space. So in role-playing games, most shifts that we experience in consciousness are transitory or temporary. For example, the transition between player and character and vice versa. The transition between daily life and the magic circle of play. The transition between what is socially prescribed and accepted as quote unquote reality and quote unquote fiction. And I'm using quotes there to distinguish between what is considered the real and what is considered the not real. So experiencing transitions in states of consciousness can be a goal in and of itself. We're not in danger of losing touch with reality by playing a role-playing game or shifting into our characters indefinitely. This is one of the big fears that people had about role-playing games when they first came out and even recently. We have this sort of alibi during play that means that we are not held responsible for what occurs during these temporary states of transition, for the most part. We do have to act ethically as members of a community. But while we're playing, we have this, this character in this fiction that allows us to behave in ways that otherwise we wouldn't. And because of that, we can experience a sense of liberation when we're transitioning into a playful state, even when we're playing a serious style of game. There are some players that will call games fun or entertainment or even escapism, which reduces the meaning of these transitional states to something that's just merely for fun or leisure. Whereas others will find profound meaning in these transitional experiences, but still keep them mostly bounded within the magic circle. So they're transitioning back to roughly the same identities, ways of relating to others, and lifestyle choices that they had before. Now, transformation, by our definition, as a prolonged and sustained state of change is different. This is a shift in one state of consciousness that has a lasting after effect. It remains prolonged and sustained long after the game has concluded, which may affect how the player views themselves, for example, their identity, how the player views reality, for example, their paradigm, how the player views others and interacts with them, for example, their relationships, how the player views society, including its structures, their place within those structures, and the roles of others within those structures, and also how the player views cultures, subcultures, and countercultural movements. So all of these things can be impacted by playing in a game. Whenever we're playing and there's some sort of transformative impact, it may also affect how others view the player outside of the game. So a good example here is gender exploration. So players often explore different genders during a role-playing game. And these people who are exploring gender may be doing it just out of curiosity or because they deeply feel that they identify with that gender, but may not feel comfortable expressing it in daily life. And for the people, particularly in the latter category, this sort of play may feel emancipatory or liberatory, as Jonea Kemper calls it, especially for queer players who experience marginalization. So emboldened by the game, a player may decide after a game to shift their gender in daily life, not just within the magic circle. And that takes a lot of bravery to do. And this is where it gets tricky because in common language, we call that transitioning. But for our purposes here, because it's prolonged and sustained, we therefore would refer to this as transformation. So if this transformation is accepted by others, particularly people within the role-playing community, but hopefully outside of it as well, it can be intensely validating and verify one's sense of social identity. And for more on this, I highly recommend Josephine Baird's work. All right, so what are the mechanisms by which we engage in transformation? There are many. We're going to go over a couple today. One is ritual and another is bleed. So let's start with ritual. So role-playing games can be viewed through the lens of ritual theory. Ritual theory emerged primarily out of anthropology, but is used in many other disciplines now. And according to Arnold van Gennep and later Victor Turner, ritual involves three separate stages, a beginning, a middle, and an end, if you will. The beginning is a departure from the mundane world through separation. And this departure often has this preparation phase attached to it where, for example, getting ready for a LARP, getting the costuming together, traveling to the site, meeting all the co-players, deciding who's going to play what, and perhaps negotiating consent. These are all things that could go into that departure or preparation phase. So you're leaving one frame of reality and entering into another. And this other frame of reality is this sort of in-between threshold state, which is called liminality. And so you may have heard this term before, being in a liminal state. It refers to these states in between social frames that have sort of new rules, at least for a temporary time, where people are enacting different kinds of roles, which sounds exactly like role-playing games. But it also is done in various other rites of passage, as we will see. And then after this liminal state, there's a return to the mundane world with an incorporation of the liminal experiences. So the idea in ritual is that the ritual itself probably has some sort of component that we take with us when we leave. So from this perspective, the magic circle of play is literally a ritual space rather than just a concept or a metaphor. And here we have an image of sort of the trajectory of a rite of passage with the first state, then the separation and liminal and incorporation phases, and then the second state. Again, this is transition. So for Victor Turner, all ritual activities create a greater sense of community among participants, or communitas, as he called it, which is this sort of sense of camaraderie, sense of connection that people who take part in this ritual experience. And for him, communitas is especially created in religious activities and other mandatory socially sanctioned rituals. These are inherently transformational in a way based on the group's belief of the social truth of the activity. Now, what I mean by that is when a group gets together, for example, for ritual, for religious ritual, and everybody in the group ostensibly believes in the truth of that ritual and that belief system, then the activities have a lot of consequence. For example, let's say someone's taking communion and they believe that the body and blood of Christ are literally transmuted, transubstantiated. This has a certain kind of impact. So similarly, if somebody is involved in the ritual of marriage, this will lead to what Turner calls a transition state from one social status to the other. We're going to call that transformational because it's something that the society recognizes outside of just the ritual. So often when we get into a role-playing game, we are temporarily agreeing to adopt this fiction, adopt these characters, etc. But it's expected that when we're done, we're going to leave those characters behind. And we're no longer going to be addressed by that name. We're no longer going to respond to those kind of fictional cues. So in that case, this would not be considered liminal from Turner's definition. It would be considered liminoid because the things that take part in the game, take place in the game, are not quote unquote socially real. So for example, if I get married in a role-playing game, that doesn't mean that I'm legally bound to be married to that player outside of a game. But if I go through a ritual of marriage outside of a game, particularly one that's being with somebody who's been ordained and the community is all expecting this to be a real marriage, then it's thought to be real. So that would be liminal. And so he says that other forms of cultural leisure rituals, such as those intended for entertainment, are considered optional rather than mandatory. And also, as I discussed, the group does not believe in the social truth of the activity in the same way. A good example of this is when famously there was a Star Trek fan who came to court to do jury duty in her Starfleet uniform. And that was not necessarily a socially acknowledged state outside of a convention space, Star Trek convention space. So it's entering one state with one set of fictional rules, social rules, and expecting it to be acknowledged in another, which is very interesting. So we often don't think of these as serious. And so, for example, role-playing games would fall into this category. They would be liminoid, as they do not technically result in a permanent change of social status for the participants. Now, within the group, people can change status, of course. That will happen in any group, regardless of what kind of activity it is. But for the most part, the things that transpire within the LARP are not held to be true in the way that we think other aspects of social reality are true. However, Victor Turner emphasized how liminoid experiences are actually exercising an individual's freedom. So they're an expression of this growing self-mastery or even self-transcendence that people with a lot of leisure time on their hands can explore. And of course, there's some classist connotations here in that, this idea of self-transcendence is something that only people with a lot of free time can go for. But still, I think it's quite interesting for us to consider how do we spend our free time? And I think the way that Turner is talking about this, and he's specifically referring to people who engage in sports teams and even sports fandom, that there is this sort of, because it is not mandatory, because it is voluntary, and it's part of one's leisure time, it's actually quite, in some ways, more important than these prescribed social rituals. And he thinks that these sorts of activities, these liminoid experiences, are actually imbued with pleasure in ways that other expected activities, such as work, are not. And he says that they are potentially capable of releasing creative powers, individual or communal, either to criticize or buttress the dominant social structural values. Now, this is extremely interesting because he's speaking directly to this power of transformation in these liminoid experiences, but he's speaking about how they can be used either to criticize or even to try to change, or to buttress, meaning to hold up the dominant value system. And so when we talk about transformation, we're not necessarily suggesting that we should always reject the dominant value system, but the space being opened up for us to actually experiment with these systems, play with them, figure out what works and what doesn't, and then return back to life is quite empowering. So at the Transformative Play Initiative, we're really interested in the middle ground here, blending this liminal and liminoid space. Because role-playing games can lead to transformative experiences that are sometimes more profound than more widely socially sanctioned rituals, we believe that it's important to strengthen the belief in the potency of the activity within role-playing groups. And this is a key component to maximizing this potential. So when we devalue or in some ways reject the potency, by calling something, for example, mere entertainment, we're not acknowledging the potential for transformation that is contained within it. And while everybody's entitled to have their own perspective on this, we're really interested in acknowledging the power of this form and what it can do. And in that, supporting each other in processes of change through communitas. And this support structure is very important because it's not just occurring during the role-playing game itself, but also afterwards and before. So it can help people make desired transformations more concrete in social reality outside of games. So when we have the support of our community, sometimes we can feel more brave to explore parts of ourselves that we wouldn't normally express, and perhaps even make those things more concrete in our daily lives. Okay, and now to the second mechanism of transformation, which is bleed. Now, there are a lot of different theories of bleed. We are going to go through 6 of them, but there are for sure others. And it's an interesting area because bleed is really discussing, similar to liminality, the space in between these frames. So when you're in one frame of reality, social reality, which is what we would call daily life, and then you're in this other frame of social reality, which is the fiction. And there's emotions, for example, and feelings that are bleeding over from one to the other. That is a really interesting space with regard to transformation. So emotional bleed, which is what I just described, is the first category. And an example of that that can happen when people play games is having negative experiences in play with each other, having that lead to animosity between the players off game. So if the characters have some sort of negative interaction, and then the players feel animosity towards each other as a result. These things can get worked through. Bleed can be processed, it can be reflected on, it can be discussed, but sometimes these immediate emotional reactions can happen. And then there's procedural bleed, and this is where physical abilities, traits, habits, and other bodily states bleed between the player and the character. So how we carry ourselves, tics, movements, reflexes that we have with our body. And one example of procedural bleed is through the character learning how to move in a way that physically exudes, for example, more sensuality. Maybe that's something that the person struggles with in their daily life or feels insecure about. And so they can learn through the character how to move in a certain way, and that maybe that carries through outside of the game. And then we have mimetic bleed, which is where ideas, thoughts, opinions, convictions, ideologies, and similar kinds of phenomena bleed between the player and the character. And values of equality and equity embedded in the structure of a game, for example, may lead to players adopting these views more readily outside of the game. So if they have a strong positive experience, let's say, with a role-playing game that focuses on these values, maybe those values become more important to them off the game and more integrated into their paradigm. And we're going to talk a lot more about paradigms as we move along. And if you're interested in this, I definitely recommend looking into Kjell Hedgard Hugo's work because he has written extensively about this. And then there's ego bleed, which is a term that was coined by Whitney Strix Beltran. And this is where aspects of one's actual personality and identity begin to bleed between the player and the character. So for example, let's say that I don't feel like I'm a very strong person, but I'm playing a very resilient and strong character. And that leads me to feel greater confidence outside of life. And not just confidence in certain situations, but actually that I have those characteristics myself as a person. That could be an example of ego bleed. And then there's emancipatory bleed, where players from marginalized backgrounds experience liberation from that marginalization through their characters. We mentioned this briefly before. Players can choose to steer towards these kinds of liberatory experiences as a means to challenge structural oppression, according to Janaea Kemper. So for example, if players want to steer towards this liberatory experience of bleed, of emancipatory bleed, and they experience a lot of oppression and marginalization in their day-to-day life. Perhaps overthrowing an oppressive structure in play might lead them to process aspects of their real life oppression in different ways in their own lives. Now, of course, we're not saying that role-playing games will cause people to no longer be marginalized. Unfortunately, that's not something we can always control. But what we can do is we can create environments where the rules of reality work a little bit differently, and where we all agree to support each other in this collective experience of play. And within those states, perhaps we can, explore new ways of being and relating that can help all of us learn how to oppress one another less, or learn how to feel a greater sense of agency and empowerment in our day-to-day lives. So it's kind of a small goal, but it's also a pretty lofty goal at the same time. And then there's romantic bleed. And this is when players feel attraction or even fall in love with fictional characters and or with the players who enact them after an intense role-playing experience. So somebody playing a romantic connection within a LARP, previously no interaction or attraction, but then after the LARP, all of a sudden having some sort of romantic or erotic feeling towards that character. And then maybe also wondering, do I feel this towards the player as well? And sometimes that's the case, and sometimes it's not. Romantic bleed is an absolutely fascinating thing to explore. And I really recommend Sana Harder's work on this particular topic because she explores what's called limerence, which is this experience of falling in love, and how complicated that can be when your frames of reality outside of a LARP don't really make room for those kinds of feelings. So I just wanted to point out that bleed is not always transformational. This should be somewhat obvious, but I just want to make clear that we're not saying that every time somebody experiences bleed, it's a transformational experience. For some people, they might actually experience bleed as negative or damaging. That's a form of transformation, but maybe not one that we want to have, and maybe not one that's progressive in the way that we're talking about. And I've done some research on this topic on how bleed that's not processed can actually really damage communities, especially role-playing groups, and cause some toxicity within the group. So communication and processing around bleed, it becomes incredibly important. Then there are other people who don't experience bleed at all. So Troels Ken Peterson is a great person to read about this, just this experience of being in a community that openly talks about bleed and having these intense experiences, but not being able to relate to that. Still enjoying the role-playing experience itself, but not being able necessarily to relate. And some people who don't experience bleed still can have transformative experiences, and they just engage in different kinds of methods of integration, such as perhaps intellectual analysis. Maybe the whole thing has been an intellectual exercise rather than an emotional one, for example. However, we would like to say that bleed offers one of these mechanisms that can help us understand pathways to transformation. We can become more aware that the frames of in-game and off-game are much more porous than we might realize. We can acknowledge this porousness as a space for great potential for steering, meaning consciously moving towards these transformative experiences. We can use bleed as a way to unlock aspects of our life that we would like to design differently. So thinking about life as a designable space, not just a game. So things that we might want to design differently include our identities, our self-concepts, our communities, our paradigms, our relationships, and many other things. And integrate our role-playing experiences, including bleed, into our own lives in intentional ways, expressing ourselves in ways that feel more authentic as discovered through play. So integration is the key factor here that we really want to think about when considering transformation. So we believe that role-playing groups have the potential to act as transformational containers, or what are also called holding environments. These holding environments hold the potential for people to catalyze lasting change in their life. And we call them secure enough holding environments, meaning that there's never an environment that's fully safe, That's an illusion because we can never be fully safe, but we can feel secure enough to take risks and to try things that we wouldn't normally try. And so here we have an image from my article with Hugos on called Magic is Real. And this is the diagram that we created that envisions role-playing as this transformational container. So on the right side, left side, you see the self, and I put that in quotes because the self is something that, as we know, transitions. But what we mean by that is the daily identity and all the social roles that go along with that. Outside of the game, people come in with goals, agreements, transparency, consent, safety structures, and community support, which gives them enough alibi to bleed in their intentions, their playfulness, and all of these goals into this magic circle of play. So all of these agreements are part of this social contract. And every time we play a role-playing game, we have some form of social contract. This is a more explicit one that allows people to consent to playing with potentially transformative material, which can be quite intense and can require quite a bit from co-players. And so when people are in this magic circle, they're experiencing this alter ego, or what we call a character. And then what we're interested in here is how can we get past that wall of alibi back out into daily life, taking the things that we want to transfer out with us into our lives through either through a process of bleed out or through some sort of other transfer. And again, there can be goals around that. There can be processing, reflection, taking specific actions towards goals, safety structures, and again, community support that allows this to happen. So here we have the self again, but it's an integrated daily identity, meaning that the magic, if you will, that was catalyzed within the role-playing space has whatever fruits were born there have come into fruition, and those have been integrated into our daily sense of self and our lives. All right, and now we have our other definition of transformation, which is that transformation is a process or series of processes that lead to growth. What do we mean by process? Well, change is rarely linear in humans. Often people want these clear input or output goals, such as design a game for this impact. And, the assumption that that will happen is often foiled. It rarely results in predictable changes in participants because humans are complex and we have complex backgrounds and psychologies that we bring into this game, social interactions and whatnot. And so trying to predict what's going to happen can be very difficult. So if we have super narrow goals, we may actually miss out on the most interesting aspects that arise. And these things arise often not from what we plan as designers or facilitators, but through emergent play, through what the players bring to the table. And also each person's individual life journey and how that game is connecting with them at that particular time. And so we think that it's better to think of games as these transformational containers that hold the potential for many different kinds of change. So in other words, we may have very specific goals that we're going for, but we should plan for the unexpected and the serendipitous. So the things that couldn't have been predicted. So from this perspective, many types of change can be valuable if they are meaningful for the participant and or if they contribute to greater awareness, joy, peace, and justice for the group as a whole. Again, lofty goals, but the idea here is that one's personal transformation or development should not take precedence over the group. And the group should also support someone in trying to explore their personal transformation. So there's an agreement there, and there's a negotiation and a calibration there. So one thing that I like to look at is different theories of change, and how they consider and conceptualize of transformation. So peace studies scholar John Paul Lederach studies conflict transformation. So he's somebody who looks at global politics and looks at peace processes in various parts of the world, as his scholarly field. And his concept of conflict transformation distinguishes it from conflict management or conflict resolution, because the connotation of management or resolution is that a conflict can be tamped down or that it can be resolved. But often conflict is always with us. It informs, a lot of the things that are happening, whether they're visible or not. And it's not always a negative thing. So even if the current situation is quite negative, is quite destructive, the paradigm of conflict transformation is a way of viewing conflict situations as opportunities to collaboratively envision positive futures together. So this is a lot like role-playing games again. Oftentimes we are literally creating scenarios that are embedded with conflict. In fact, there are a lot of LARP designers that will say you have to have conflict, otherwise you don't have a LARP. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, because humans are conflict creating machines with or without embedded conflict structures. But this idea of being in a state of conflict and then collaboratively envisioning what happens next is very much what we do in role-playing games. And envisioning it as a positive future is something that I would like to see more of. We've spent a lot of time exploring different kinds of power fantasies and different ways that things can go horribly wrong, ways that people can oppress each other and whatnot. I would like to see us envisioning more positive futures that are just for everybody. So in terms of change, rather than a linear process, Lederach views change as a circle. So the idea behind the circle is things will move forward for a while, then they'll hit a wall and movement will stop. And then they'll move backward and it'll seem like we're 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, if you've ever heard that phrase. And then they may even collapse and then they move forward again. So the idea here is that change is not linear at all. In fact, a lot of times when change is happening, it may look like the opposite. It may look like backtracking, but this is all part of the process. And we'll go into some of the reasons why that might be the case as we move forward. So similarly, Lederach emphasizes that change is not just one event, one linear event, but rather a series of change processes that require many strategies to address the complexity of the conflicts with them. So these strategies here are envisioned as a spiral containing a web of dynamic circles that create momentum and direction. So this approach allows us to embrace our need for linearity and forward movement, because we do really like linear plots, for example, storylines. We may take a bunch of random events and string them together into a coherent narrative, because that's how we make sense of the world. But that's not the way the world unfolds. Generally, things are actually a lot more chaotic and confusing. So it gives us this sense of linearity, but it also allows for feedback loops, for that circular process to happen, and for iteration to happen. And that those kinds of activities are associated with circularity. So coming back to the problem, figuring out what we can do next to try to create an even better future, essentially. And this encourages us to integrate both short-term and long-term strategies into planning for the future. And so there may be, larger issues that need to be addressed, but that doesn't mean that we're stopping with short-term changes that we're making. So that's why these are change processes. There's multiple processes happening at the same time. And it encourages us to employ yes and thinking, which some of you may be familiar with if you're familiar with improvisational theater, meaning that we are being encouraged to improvise what happens next, and to also try to look for win-win collaborative scenarios, even when things look like they can't possibly be win-win. Sometimes that may be the case. Maybe there is no win-win, but a lot of times it just hasn't been envisioned yet. Now, this should sound familiar and relevant to game designers, and really any process of playfulness, of learning, and several other kinds of human processes, learning how to be in relationship with one another, learning how to, step into a profession. There's all sorts of situations that this can relate to, which is why I'm so interested in conflict theory, because we are truly have conflict at the center of the majority of things that happen in our life, whether we're aware of it or not. So the way this is visualized, here's the image, which he calls the rotini, for those of you who know about rotini pasta. It's a simple process structure, he says, but it's basically this spiral of circles. So we take that same circular image that we had before, and we're moving forward in time with it, and therefore it becomes both linear and circular at the same time. So along with this, growth is actually a highly individual process. And this is why it gets really tricky to try to plan for, let's say, 100 LARP players to have the same kind of transformative experience. That's going to be hard because people grow at different speeds, at different rates and frequencies, and even intensities, depending on their situation and depending on the proclivities of that person. Some people really fear change and try their hardest to avoid it, which is a completely legitimate way to go through life. If that's what makes people feel safe, then absolutely understandable. But for people who are interested in transformation and want to embrace change and want to see if they can use change as this opportunity for growth that is positive in some way, it can be helpful to have a catalytic space like a role-playing game. Growth is also often messy in the moment. So for example, when we're in a process of change, often we're embroiled in some sort of internal or external conflict, and that needs to be addressed, and that can feel extremely unpleasant for everyone involved. And we symbolize this by the caterpillar, going into the cocoon and kind of becoming a mess inside of it, and then transforming into this beautiful butterfly. The butterfly doesn't just happen. There's this whole uncomfortable process of dissembling, basically, and coming back together as something new. So growth may be embraced by the person who's experiencing it. And some people have what's called a growth mindset. You may have heard that term recently, which is seeing any kind of failure or any kind of strife or struggle as an opportunity for growth. But alternatively, it may be resisted by the person who's experiencing it. There are some opportunities for growth that we just don't want to experience. They're just too painful, and that's completely understandable. And so I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about resistance, because resistance is not necessarily a bad thing. Oftentimes it's quite important. So there is a therapeutic practice called motivational interviewing, and it envisions processes of individual change similarly to Letterac's circular model that I just showed you. Motivational interviewing was developed, I believe, particularly to address people who deal with some sort of addiction, and to, instead of telling them what to do, which does not work, if you're trying to get somebody to change, telling them what to do doesn't work. It's instead a series of questions and an inquiry, helping people dive deeper into their own experience of addiction, and perhaps going through this process of questioning, through this interview process, as they call it, maybe opening up to the idea of change. And so they have this model called the wheel of change, and they describe it as an upward spiral. So again, we have that spiral motif. And this wheel of change has several steps. So there's the pre-contemplation step, where the person really doesn't have any intention of changing their behavior. Then there's the contemplation, where people are aware there's a problem that exists, but there's no commitment to action. Then there's the preparation. So remember, we talked about preparation with liminality. So this intention to take action. There's the action itself, which is an active modification of behavior. So we don't even modify behavior in this model until step 4. That's how difficult it can be to change our behavior, even if we want to. And then the next stage is maintenance. So sustaining that change, sustaining the new behavior and replacing the old. So remember when we talked about the first definition of, change that is sustained, change that is prolonged. We can experience change in the short term very easily. That is not hard. What is hard is maintaining it. And that's where integration practices become important. And then there's this experience of relapse that can happen, where people fall back into their old patterns of behavior. Now, this can be extremely frustrating and upsetting, and for people with addiction, sometimes even life-threatening if they experience a relapse, but it makes sense psychologically. And I'm going to explain why in a moment when we talk about the way that identity is formed. But this model sees relapse as the next part of the spiral. So then we go back to this pre-contemplation phase and then contemplation, et cetera. So relapse doesn't mean failure and stop. Relapse just means that there's that same cycle that Lederach talks about, where we may actually, things might collapse, but that actually leads to things moving forward. So this, for me, is a very reassuring. All of these models are very reassuring with regard to change. Change doesn't always look how we want it to. It's not always cut and dry. And sometimes it may look like the opposite is happening, but that doesn't mean that we're not moving forward. So from this perspective, both relapse and resistance are considered central components of the change process. So in each of these stages, there are little moments of resistance where there's a part of the self that either wants to keep all of those thoughts unconscious or wants to challenge them, wants to come up with excuses why not to do them, maybe wants to lure the person back into the behavior that they're trying to change, etc. So why do we do that? Resistance is not always a bad thing. It can be part of the process. So here are some examples of common points of resistance. One is resistance to loss, resistance to letting go of someone or something that's important to us. And that could even include our feeling of control. Sometimes we're afraid to lose control. Another point of resistance might be intimacy, resistance to opening up to others and potentially getting hurt. This is extremely common, especially for those of us who've had experiences of being harmed before by people who love us. It makes sense that we would be afraid to open up again after that. Similar to that is vulnerability. So resistance to lowering our defense mechanisms, because these have kept us safe in the past. If we don't open up, then we don't get hurt. We also miss out on joy and bliss and connection and all the things that make life really, really wonderful, but we are protecting ourselves. Another point of resistance is our identity, and we'll talk about this in more depth in a second, but resistance to any process that might invite us to question our sense of self. It could be very, very destabilizing to question our sense of self. So when we're talking about exploring identity and we're talking about shifting into different altered states of consciousness through these games, a lot of people don't necessarily think about it that way when they're playing. They're just quote unquote playing a game, right? It's just fun. It's just an escape, etc. But really on one level, what's happening is a different identity is taking hold and is being projected. And becoming aware of that can be really destabilizing. And then there's also our paradigms. We might be resistant to any process that might invite us to question our paradigm or our worldview, the way that we look at reality. And then finally, we have the status quo. This one is kind of the hardest one sometimes to let go of, because Even if we're not completely happy in the status quo, at least it's predictable. So we might have resistance to any process that might destabilize our perceptions or disrupt our desire to keep living our lives the way that we currently are. So yes, we could envision this possible positive future, but actually things are okay right now. So let's just stay where we're at. These are all examples of points of resistance. And of course, there are many more. So one part of resistance that's important to consider is that when we're talking about change, we're talking about learning. It's really difficult to talk about transformation without also looking into models of pedagogy and education, because really as humans, we are constantly learning as we're experiencing. And that is a core component of what transformation is. It's learning about ourselves and others. So learning is similarly a very complicated process wherein we must confront new material and figure out whether or not to integrate it into our understanding of reality. So there are some complications that come up with the learning process. One of those is cognitive dissonance, which is when we receive this new information, but it contradicts our existing model of reality or our worldview. And that causes a sense of disruption, of feeling very off balance. It can be extremely upsetting, distressing. And what can arise is this identity defense, as it's called. I remember we've been talking about exploring identity. If a person is compelled to reject new information, it might be because it threatens their paradigm in some way, or it's perceived to be incompatible with their identity, meaning their sense of self. So if I've built my worldview on a particular political belief, for example, and somebody presents an alternative version of reality that does not combine well with my perception of it, my identity defense might jump in and say, no, that's not true, and just reject the information wholesale, even if it's true. And this is one of the things that we struggle with a lot in terms of having conversations with each other and sharing information. The cognitive dissonance and the identity defense are often, at the core of some of these conflicts we have with each other, actually. So as adults, we have to learn how to deal with this new information. And the reason I'm talking about adulthood here is we're mostly talking about transformation for, either adolescents or young adults or full adults. Now, of course, transformative role-playing games can be run for people of all ages, but we're really looking at adult learning here because that's where the identity becomes pretty solid. In adolescence, there's a lot of experimentation with it, but in early adulthood and later adulthood, it becomes stronger. So whenever we have this new information come in, we can, according to Jean Piaget, we can assimilate it, meaning we can absorb it into our existing cognitive schemas, perceptions, and understandings. So it's a complex way of understanding the way that the brain absorbs information, but essentially we have these models that are created and we fit information into those models or into those categories. And so we find some way to fit it in, to assimilate it. There's also accumulation or mechanical learning. This is more for young children, which is where they absorb information outside of an existing context of understanding. So before they've actually built this schema, they're just sort of taking in information as it comes. But most of us have these schemas. And so oftentimes if something comes in that we don't know how to absorb into an existing schema, we might have to revise that existing schema in order to accommodate this new information and make room for this new knowledge. Some people are not willing to do that, right? So they're just going to reject that knowledge. But Illyris talks about how accommodation can be demanding or even painful. It requires a strong supply of mental energy. Learning is hard. Transformation is hard. So it takes a lot of bravery and a lot of dedication actually to go through these processes. There's a reason why school is challenging. And it's not just because there are a lot of tasks. It's because there's a lot of new information and a lot that's being expected of us cognitively. And when we add the emotional component of something like a role-playing game, then there's many different levels of challenge occurring here. And then finally, there's transformative learning. And that's when we restructure entire clusters of these schemas in our minds as the result of what Illyris calls a crisis-like situation. You may have heard of the term identity crisis. It could be an identity crisis or something similar. But it's this moment where challenges are urgent and unavoidable, and we just can't get away from the information. And this often requires a personality change. So we're talking really transformative, really intense shifts that occur. And if you recall, we talked about ego bleed briefly, Whitney Strix-Beltran's concept of how, after playing a LARP, we can actually shift our identity. Certain personality traits might spill over into our daily selves. Again, this is a form of transformation that can occur. We believe that role-playing, like other altered states of consciousness, can challenge us to face these points of resistance. So resistance is not necessarily a bad thing. As we know, sometimes it serves a purpose, but sometimes it can really get in the way of us finding happiness in life. So we can release control in a role-playing game of how we typically present ourselves to the outside world. And we can present someone new. And this can be extremely liberatory. So not having to always be smart or always be on top of things or always be serious or whatever it is that we feel like we have to present. Irving Goffman would call it our public face, or our positive face, for example, is the face that we put up in order to interact with other people, and so that we can manage the way that they look and think at us and think about us. We can change that in a role-playing game. Perhaps we can play someone who doesn't care about those things or who's unaware of those things, and that can actually feel really liberatory. We can choose to open up and experience connection with others inside and outside of the fiction. We can inhabit other ways of being, thinking, and perceiving. And these ways might be radically different from our own lived experience. And I highly recommend looking at Diana Leonard's work with regard to some of the benefits that we can psychologically experience when we inhabit people, particularly from marginalized perspectives that we don't share, but also some of the drawbacks of that. And then this role-playing process allows us to temporarily release our attachment to our identities. Thus, it can potentially bypass the identity defense that would normally arise. So I've talked to therapists, for example, who describe how playing therapeutic Dungeons and Dragons with a group can actually accelerate the growth process very, very quickly, that they can accomplish more in just a couple sessions of playing Dungeons and Dragons with adolescents, let's say, than in a year of talk therapy. And then the question is why? Well, what happens is this bypass is experienced as a relaxation of our usual vigilance. So we usually have these defense mechanisms. We're vigilant, we're on guard. And when we play, when we are able to engage in a state of playfulness, sometimes that vigilance can relax. And the role and the fiction can also really help with that because the stakes are much lower. And this makes a space for transformation in ways that are not always as quick, as potent, or even possible in other contexts. So here are some examples of change processes that I have witnessed or heard about or experienced myself that could be set in motion by shifting states of consciousness in role-playing games. And when we say change processes, remember, we're not talking about one decision. We're talking about that whole cycle, which often requires a lot of commitment. So for example, playing a game and then deciding to leave an unfulfilling relationship after having experienced a more authentic style of relating through play. Deciding to change careers after experiencing a boost of confidence after playing a new social role in a game, such as a leader. Some people say they did not perceive themselves to have any leadership abilities until they were forced to LARP a leader. And because of those circumstances, they discovered within themselves something that helped them on their career path, actually made them want to change careers. Deciding to leave certain social groups and certain coping mechanisms that one might find unhealthy or detrimental to their well-being, such as communities that are built around binge drinking. Perhaps people, through this experience of play, find something that's fulfilling to them, and is more healthy for them. Or they could decide to shift their beliefs on a particular issue. Again, this is hard. It doesn't happen very often, but LARP can do this. Role-playing can do this. It can help us shift our beliefs on a particular issue. And it may even cause us to engage in activism around that issue when before perhaps we didn't care that much about it or even held an opposite view. So these changes are not immediate. They are processes. They require commitment, persistence, and determination long after the play process is ended. So this isn't about a designer tricking you into thinking a certain way or acting a certain way, and then you changing your life as a result of it. This is a commitment on the part of the player to want to engage in this change. And when we talk about transformation in this way, we really want to emphasize that this is a choice. So someone is choosing to change. They're not being forced in some way. Or they're learning how to navigate a change that is inevitable. So for example, Kugos is doing a lot of work on death. Death is something that is inevitable. It is a change that all of us will experience, none of us can get out of, and therefore it's a topic that comes up a lot in games. It's something that we try to work through in these role-playing games, either practicing dying ourselves or practicing witnessing somebody we love go through a transition like that. It's not something we would ever want, but it is inevitable. But ultimately, as players, we should be able to choose the degree to which we face our own points of resistance. This is super important. We can't decide for another person what they should be experiencing. They need to opt into that. So undergoing processes of transition or transformation should always be consensual. We may not always be aware of these processes as they're taking place, but we should always be able to calibrate with others and to self-advocate as needed. So to be able to, for example, stop play and discuss with other players where things might need to be adjusted, and to advocate for our own needs. And I would say that a healthy role-playing community fosters a feeling of safety, fosters collaboration, communication, and self-advocacy. And also a healthy role-playing community discourages peer pressure on people to push past their boundaries. And instead, it invites people to explore their edges for growth. So I'm going to go over that one more time because it's a nuance that can be very difficult to understand. So think about how it feels, the words peer pressure on people to push past their boundaries versus inviting people to explore their edges for growth. So a growth edge is a place where you could be able to play. Vygotsky would call it a zone of proximal development. So this area where with a little bit of support, you can learn and you can explore. That is very different than pushing past our boundaries into places that may harm us or traumatize us in some way, or at the very least, overwhelm us. So to conclude, as I mentioned before, at the Transformative Play Initiative, our view of transformation is inherently progressive, meaning that we acknowledge that there are many forms of transformation that are not desirable, that play could incentivize. But we're really interested in creating more joy, more peace, and more justice in the world. So takeaways from this talk: role-playing games can be transformative. They can create space for players to alter their view of themselves or others in significant ways, shift the way they relate to others interpersonally, and even redesign social and cultural dynamics in ways that can build towards greater awareness, peace, and justice. Here are my citations, which I will also include in the description. And here's my contact information if you would like to get in touch with me. Again, my name is Sarah Lynne Bowman with the Transformative Play Initiative at Uppsala University's Department of Game Design. Thank you so much for your time and attention.